Welcome everyone. It's so exciting to see people from across the world joining in, and happy International Women's Day to all of you. So my name is Janan Nuri and I'm one of the librarians at the Royal College of Nursing. So in this talk, we're going to be exploring women's history in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And we're going to be focusing on 2 strands of political activism. The first is women's fight for the right to vote, and the second is for the regulation of the nursing profession. And we're going to be focusing on activities in London because, as Sarah just mentioned, most of the content is from research done for a self-guided walking tour, which we released through the app Museum, which is available for free. Again, like across the world, you can just download it from your app store. So just a few things before we get stuck in. I'm sure that most of you know that in 1918 in the UK, the suffrage movement finally won voting rights for some women. And the campaign actually started as early as 1870. And there were 2 terms that are usually associated with this movement to describe supporters. The title suffragist was the original term given to those campaigning for the right to vote. And they lobbied Parliament, they used methodical, peaceful means to try and get the vote. Now, some in the movement became frustrated and more militant in their tactics as time went on. They smashed windows, they chained themselves to railings, and some were even arrested for their actions. And these more militant women were given the label suffragettes. Now, this is a really simplistic way to look at this period of history. I mean, in reality, women and males over the fight for suffrage, from local factions to political unions to groups focusing on tax. I mean, it gave me a whole new appreciation for the running joke in Life of Brian, of the Monty Python's Life of Brian, you know, the Judean People's Front or the People's Front of Judea, like all of these different groups are like aiming to reach the same goal, but all having these different names. So anyway, it might help to think of the supporters of female suffrage, each being like a thread in a complex tapestry, and we're going to be exploring some of those threads today. Now, our story begins with the first offices of the College of Nursing, which was originally based at 7 Henrietta Place. We didn't gain the status as a royal college until 1939. And actually, we were the first women's only organisation to be awarded a royal charter. Now, the College of Nursing was founded in 1916 by Dame Sarah Swift. And she wanted to standardise nursing training and to ensure that nursing had a future as a profession. Sarah Swift is one of my heroes for many reasons. She was famous for being 4'11" and wearing massive hats to make up for it. You can see a photo of her here on the left next to Queen Mary, wearing one of her rather fantastic hats. And her nickname amongst her peers was the Mighty Atom, because she was small but full of energy. And I love this idea that she set her sights on a goal and she would not stop until she achieved it. Now, the college was set up at the same time as women in England were campaigning for the right to vote, and there's a strong link between the history of nursing at this time and the Votes for Women campaign. Like the suffrage movement, the campaign for recognising nursing as a profession had started decades before. Grassroots support for nurses grew during the First World War, and that's when the movement for nursing registration really began to gain momentum. So the country's wartime reliance on nurses was highlighted during the war, and it also emphasised the fact that, you know, at this time, like, there was no way of knowing just how many qualified nurses that actually were in the country who could help. Now, it's also important to know, going back to the suffrage campaign, that the image of the nurse was really important. So the leaders of the suffrage movement were aware, you know, of how important appearance is. It's what today we'd call PR and marketing. They needed women who looked smart, excuse me, who looked smart, educated, and provided a service that the public valued. And part of it was also the idea that it represented the kind of middle class image of being like respectable and tidy. So these photos are from the Museum of London's collection and were taken by the photographer Christina Broom, who photographed quite a lot of suffragettes and marches. And you can see here nurses in a procession. And this photo on the left shows a woman holding the symbol for medicine as well, and both from suffrage marches. So nursing was predominantly a women's profession, and it was the perfect answer to, providing this image. And later we're going to explore some more of these connections between nursing activism and suffrage. But back to the College of Nursing for now. By 1920, the college was outgrowing its headquarters, and so they set their sights on a nearby property with some colourful history. Now, this image shows 20 Cavendish Square as it is today, and it's the RCN's headquarters in London. I just need a moment to get over how much I miss the building, because obviously we've been working at home for the past year. This next photo I'm going to show is the same building from around 1910. At that time, you can see they were 4 separate buildings, and over the years they were merged together. So the front you can see here is actually that building just here. So how did we come to purchase this building? Enter one of my all-time favourites, Lady Cowdray, who was also known as Annie Pearson. Now, the story goes that in 1920, one of the college's founders shared a short taxi ride with her, and they said something along the lines of, "The College of Nursing is growing every day. We need more space for teaching, for our offices and for our members. That old Asquith house is up for sale. Please purchase it for us." To which Lady Cowdray responded, "Yes, of course." And I wish it was that easy to get, that much money these days. So she bought 20 Cavendish Square for £20,000 in 1920, which I don't know if it would have been a lot back then. But she was very clever. She bought the freehold for it. Now, Cowdray supported a variety of women's causes. She helped fund nurses going into training. She also funded some nurses' pensions and those who were in hardship. And she was also a wealthy suffragist. She supported the cause, and she even held a reception for militant suffrage leader Evelyn Pankhurst at her Scottish estate. Now, whenever we're talking about property, there's always this idea of location, location, location. And the location of 20 Cavendish Square is really significant, because just off the square to the north is Harley Street, which is famous for being the medical heart of London. And this location really put nursing at the centre of the medical world that had previously been dominated by men. And this was in 1920, just 2 years after some women had gained the right to vote. So it was quite a coup that the College of Nursing managed to get this building. Now, as I said, Cowdray was a smart lady. She purchased the freehold, which means, the land that the building is actually on. And the College of Nursing have it on leasehold for 999 years, which in my head is like, past nuclear fallout stage, like we'll still technically be, have the building on leasehold. And we pay a peppercorn rent to the Cowdray family to this day, which is kind of like a nominal fee. I think it's something like £100 a year to have this like amazing building in a brilliant location. Now, if you've ever been to the RCN's HQ, you might have noticed a blue plaque on the front of the building. Now, before the College of Nursing moved in, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith lived here, and it was quite an opulent residence. You can see some images from the sale brochure here of the ballroom, which is now where Dame Donna Kinnair, our General Secretary, has her office. It's obviously changed a little bit since then. Like, it would be a bit weird to have your office in a room like that. And I mean, the building to this day still also has an original painted staircase that dates back from 1710, which I haven't put on this slide, but I will tweet a photo of it later to show you from the RCN Library's account, don't worry. So if you're ever in London after the pandemic, you can actually book a tour of the building through the RCN Library. And it's well worth it to see some of those gorgeous features, as well as to learn a bit more about the RCN's history. So what's important to know about Asquith is that he was staunchly against the suffrage movement. And whilst at this address, Asquith's home became the target of a few suffragette protests, one of which we're going to explore in a moment. Now, after Asquith moved out from this property, the College of Nursing moved in, and at the time, membership was entirely female. Men weren't allowed to join the college until 1960. And I mean, in my mind, it serves as a kind of justice to all the women who protested on Asquith's doorstep that, you know, it became the home of like a women's only organisation up until 1960. So next we're going to explore one of those protests in a bit more detail. And I don't know if you can see the title of the slide because of Zoom, but it's called The Suffragettes Assemble. So this chapter in our story takes place on the 21st of June, 1906. Now the suffragettes were angry that they paid taxes, but were still unable to vote. And they decided to lobby Asquith, who at the time was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was firmly against the suffrage movement. Now, despite all of the letters that Asquith received and all of the demonstrations in front of his house, he remained insistent that there was no demand for the vote from the women of England. I know. I see, see a few of you shaking your heads. Now, on that June day, 1906, a deputation of 40 suffragettes gathered in Cavendish Square. Amongst them were Teresa Billington Gregg, who you can see here, and Annie Kenny, you can see photographed here with Christabel Pankhurst, both of whom would go on to become well-known names in the suffrage movement. Now, as they gathered, police were already preparing to impede their way and prevent them from seeing Asquith. The suffragettes marched across the square. The net curtains inside Asquith's home twitched in anticipation as his household staff nervously watched the procession march towards them. Meanwhile, Asquith was rumoured to have escaped out the back in his car and sneaked off to Downing Street. On reaching the front door of number 20, they were blocked by the police. Billington Gregg tried to force her way past them and was struck in the face by a policeman. Being from Manchester, she was quite feisty. She slapped him back before he reportedly grabbed her by the throat. Inside, the maids were said to have pointed and laughed at the scene, which shows that not every woman supported the suffrage movement. Billington Gregg was fined for assaulting a police officer, but after refusing to pay was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment. Annie Kenny, Jane Sparborough and Adelaide Knight were also arrested that day, and they were the first women to be arrested and imprisoned in London whilst campaigning for women's right to vote. So this incident outside Asquith's home is a really important one in suffrage history. Christabel Pankhurst said of this event, militancy had now begun in London, and it began in Cavendish Square. As a member of RCN staff, I love the fact that the suffragette militancy began on the doorstep of our headquarters. Now, this isn't the only link between the suffrage movement and nursing. As we said earlier, the image of the nurse and other professions was important to the suffrage movement. But they weren't just there to help with marketing the image. In fact, at the National Archives, out of all of the women who were arrested over the suffrage movement, at least 16 of them that you can see listed here had the occupation of nurse. We found this out from the Women's Suffrage Resource website, but I mean, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because nursing registration hadn't been enacted in law at this point. So there's no way for us to know for sure who was a nurse and who wasn't, and the number could be much higher. Also, sometimes women gave fake names when they were arrested, or they simply didn't list their occupation. So where we made the comparison earlier of this area of history being like a complex tapestry, there are lots of like hidden threads that are either yet to be discovered or have been lost. There's one nurse in particular from this list that caught my attention, and I'm ashamed to say it was initially because of her unique name, and that's Lettice Annie Floyd. I'm not sure if you're meant to say her name as Lettice or Lettice, but I mean, it stuck out to me. And after doing some digging, no gardening puns intended, her story is quite fascinating. So Floyd was in a position where she didn't have to work thanks to the money her father left her and her sister when he passed away. But she hated the idea of an idle life. So in 1880, she started work at a children's hospital. Again, because there were no proper registers for nurses at the time, it's difficult to find out too much. But we were able to find this letter that she wrote to the publication, the hospital. And this page is from 1899. And here it says she was sister of the Nottingham Children's Hospital for 3 years. And we also know from other sources she started there in 1888. So we can confirm that she was a nurse. She's said to have left nursing because she found it dispiriting, and commented that as most of the cases seemed to be due to bad housing, bad feeding, and immorality, it was not entirely satisfactory work, and it did not go to the root of the matter. So instead, Floyd turned her attention to politics and suffrage. Now, she joined the suffrage movement in 1907, and in 1908 joined the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU, which was the union created by Evelyn Pankhurst, and was the one which was quite a lot more militant. And Floyd was an active member. She would sell suffragette publications, donate generously to the cause, and by 1908 she was working for the Bristol branch when she met Annie Williams. Now, in a few sources, it's mentioned that the two became lifelong companions, that they were romantically involved and were quite open about it in the movement. But this is where that thread of Floyd's life becomes a hidden one. And there are all of these layers of like intersectionality that cross over and make it so much harder to find out more about her. You know, she was a woman, a nurse, a suffragette, part of queer history, but her story is still a hidden one. And despite her and Williams working together, I mean, they even headed up the Wales branch for a time, Floyd, it seems, didn't think her story was important. In 1932, there was a group set up the Suffragette Fellowship Collection to try and collect some history from former WSPU members, you know, to try and save some of that history. And that group got in touch with Floyd and Williams, and Floyd responded saying, "There is really nothing in my life worth writing about." I know it's, and I think like we kind of see it today, like there's a lot of people who think like I'm not a role model or I'm not that important, and it's like you are, and your story is important and you should save things. So unfortunately it's a challenge to find out more about her, and I've yet to even discover a photo of her. So if anyone has any more information or photos, I'd be so grateful to see it. So what we do know, she was imprisoned in October 1908 during the rush of the House of Commons, and she served 1 month in Holloway Prison. She also took part in the window smashing campaign in London's West End, and in 1912, and that led to her being sentenced to another term in prison, during which she endured a hunger strike and, as a consequence, forced feeding. And she died on the 4th of April 1934 with Annie Williams by her side. Now we're going to turn next to another nurse who was in the suffragette camp, and that's nurse Ellen Pitfield. So she's listed on the Suffrage Resource website as well, but not as a nurse, even though she was one. So this letter is from the National Archives, and it's one that she sent to Evelyn Pankhurst in 1912. So she says, "I am with you, heart and soul, in the great demonstration on March the 4th, 1912, a soldier to the death, Nurse Ellen Pitfield," and soldiers with capital S as well, really like driving it home. Again, it's hard to find sources about her activities as a nurse, as this was before nurse registration, but what we were able to find, it seems that she was a midwife. Now, we know Pitfield was arrested 5 times, and again, she was one of the women who were force-fed in 1909 following hunger strike. What's sad is that Pitfield's prison experiences destroyed her health, reduced her to poverty, and damaged her career. After being released in 1909, she's reported to have said, "There are only 2 things that matter to me in the world, principle and liberty. For these I will fight as long as there is life in my veins. I am no longer an individual, I am an instrument." Now, she was arrested again in 1911, and as she left the dock at the criminal court, she shouted, "I suffer for the freedom of all women." And unfortunately, she did suffer, particularly during this last spell in prison. According to Sylvia Pankhurst, Nurse Pitfield was injured in the Black Friday demonstrations in November 1910, and cancer developed in the wound. Now, we know some of her story from articles in publications like The Vote and the British Journal of Nursing that we'll explore later. So in 1912, she was in a cell alone the entire 45 days she served, only seeing prison officials and on 2 occasions a female doctor. In the last 2 weeks, she was unable to turn in bed unassisted and was in incredible pain. In one instance, she collapsed to the floor as a warden was making her bed and was refused help to get up. Eventually, another prisoner was called to help and she was roughly dragged back into bed. So we can see here in the suffragette publication, The Vote, that she died in a nursing home from cancer on the 8th of August 1912, and she was aged 45. We've also found her on the 1911 census, which is important. It is census year this year for us here in the UK or in England and Wales. So here you can see Ellen Pitfield, but under occupation it simply says suffragettes, refuses information. And we'll explore some of the activities around the 1911 census next. So the suffragettes made a rallying call in 1911 to women to spoil their census data, saying, "If women don't count, neither shall they be counted." Throughout the evening of the 2nd of April 1911, women across the country took action, including at 9 Colosseum Terrace. Before I show you that picture, so you can see here, like this is a page from the census. Somebody's pasted a flyer, no votes for women, no census, and where the information should be written, it just says no persons here, only women. All right, so we're going to be looking at 9 Colosseum Terrace, and you can see a photo of the building as it looks today here. So Colosseum Terrace is just up the road from Harley Street. It's in the medical heart of London, and it was lodgings for nurses. And 10 of the nurses who were living here described themselves as suffragist, as well as giving their medical profession. So this is the page, or one of the pages for 9 Colosseum Terrace. And hopefully you can all see my mouse. So you've got, for example, here it says matron and suffragist, nurse and suffragist. And you can see here Agnes Maud Mayners wrote nurse and protesting suffragette. Next door were some more nurses. One in particular that caught my attention was Harley Foster, who simply described herself as suffragist. although she was a trained nurse, having qualified in April 1902. And we know that because we found her records from the Royal British Nursing Association's roll of members from 1909 here, and that's available on Ancestry as well. We've made those records available. Now, in several other houses along this street were other homes for nurses where residents also described themselves as nurse and suffragist. So far, we haven't been able to find any other records of groups of nurses doing this in the UK because of the way the metadata is on Ancestry. You have to search by name rather than occupation when you're viewing the census. But we can imagine, though, that those in Colosseum Terrace discussed what they would write beforehand, and that there would have been similar discussions across the country from other suffrage supporters. What's also interesting is that not all of the nurses who lived here described themselves as suffragists. So you can see here you've got like trained nurse down here, or it looks like it says trained nurse at the bottom. I mean, perhaps some of them didn't support votes for women, or maybe they were scared that writing that would affect their careers or employability in future. And we really saw that earlier with Nurse Pitfield. So we've explored some stories of nurses who were suffragettes, and we're teetering over the edge into the suffragist camp. So we're going to explore some of those threads next. So we're here at Ethel Gordon Fennec's former home. So it's not too far from Colosseum Terrace, and it's a former home of nurse, writer and reformer Ethel Gordon Fennec. She was also known as Mrs. Bedford Fennec, which is why at the top of the slide I've written Ethel Gordon Bedford Fennec to kind of cover all bases. So she lived here at 20 Upper Wimpole Street, which you can see on the right there, from 1887 until her death in 1947. And she was a very capable nurse. At the age of 24, she was appointed matron of St Bartholomew's Hospital, which is one of the most prestigious hospitals in London. She was said to have a really strong sense of purpose, and she was really hardworking with high standards, and she expected the same from her staff. I probably would have been terrified working for her. Like, you can imagine her being a very strict matron. She founded the British Journal of Nursing, which was formerly the Nursing Record, and she was the editor from 1903 until her death. And in her editorial columns, Fennec often wrote about the campaign for nursing registration, and she also supported women's suffrage. She marched at demonstrations, even used the journal to help raise money for suffragettes who had just come out of prison. And the British Journal of Nursing also wrote frequently about the plight of Nurse Pitfield, and led a petition for her release. In one article from April 1912, which you can see here, Fennec wrote passionately about the petition that they'd started. So you can see she wrote, in tabulating the signatures, we were painfully struck with the fact that matrons of large hospitals and members of their nursing staff have not added their names and influence to a petition for the release of a fellow worker and human being who is dying of cancer in prison. And she added that their names should have been first on the list, saying she hoped they would now add their names to remove any suspicion in the public mind that highly trained and highly placed nurses are indifferent to suffering. So yeah, very passionate and very fierce in the way that she communicated. Fennec's influence was very wide-reaching. In another article, she mentions that nurses from Australia even signed the petition as well. And closer to home, a West End medical man, as he's described in this article, said, you know, I'm a anti-suffragist, but even I've signed the petition. He got his friends to do the same. And he said, knowing as I do the fearful ravages of this disease, whatever she has done, her illness is more than sufficient punishment. and that prison life would only aggravate the cancer that she had. So as we said, Fennec was also a supporter of nursing registration. So in 1887, she founded and led the Royal British Nursing Association, and that formed the first ever list of qualified nurses in Britain. So nurses like Harley Foster, who we saw earlier on the census, were included in that list. But it was very exclusive. It was only nurses with at least 3 years of experience who were included. Now, in the same neighbourhood as Fennec's home was the future site of the General Nursing Council, or where the headquarters were, which is on 23 Portland Place. And it was set up after the Nurses Registration Act in 1919. And they were responsible for deciding the rules of admission to the Register of Nurses. If you're feeling a little bit confused, so in 1984, the name was changed to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, or the NMC as it's known today, but originally it was the GNC. And to this day, the NMC hold the register of nurses who are currently fit to practice. Now, the original GNC board was made up of members from the Royal British Nursing Association, which included Ethel Gordon Fennec, and there were also nurses from the College of Nursing too. Like the fight for suffrage, the fight for nursing registration began decades earlier in the 1880s. Nurse activist Beatrice Kent wrote in the suffragette publication The Vote that had they, nurses, been armed with that powerful weapon, the vote, then they would have been victorious long ago in getting the Nursing Registration Act through Parliament. Now, if you're not a nurse, you might be thinking, why do I keep going on about nursing registration? Why is it so important? And, you know, we really have to understand the political importance of having a register of nurses. We shouldn't underestimate that, because having a register secured nursing as a valued profession. And it meant that campaigns for better pay and working conditions could begin, because before then anybody could say they were a nurse and there were no standards. So you might get someone who's really amazing at being a nurse and someone else who, you know, just does it on the odd day here and there, but doesn't actually know like the right, you know, way to care for people. So it's this idea of like standardizing what does it mean to be a nurse, and then from there you can build up the profession. So once the Nurses Registration Act was passed in 1919, Ethel Gordon Fennec is said to have been seen wandering around outside the new GNC building, eagerly awaiting to sign herself up on the register. And I mean, she succeeded in her goal. She is nurse number 1 on the register. All of that pacing around outside of the building worked. So you can see her registration number here, number 1. And our Dame Sarah Swift, the founder of the College of Nursing, was number 2 on the register. And I bet Ethel Fennec loved rubbing it in her face, but I don't know, that's just me. Me kind of like embellishing it a bit. All right, so staying in the medical vein and right around the corner at 20 Upper Berkeley Street is the former home of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Now, she was the first woman to qualify in England as a physician and surgeon in 1865, but her career actually started as a surgery nurse at Middlesex Hospital, and she was also a suffragist. So Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was the older sister of Millicent Fawcett, who was a famous figure in the suffrage movement and leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Remember what I told you earlier about the Judean People's Fund and the People's Fund of Jesus is another, anyway. So again, like that was a really big group. Like you've got the WSPU, which the Pankhurst started, and then the NUWSS, which Millicent Fawcett started. And Fawcett Society was a lot more very much like the suffragist side of it, whereas the WSP was very much like suffragettes and a bit more militant, or a lot more militant, I should say. So when the two women were young, Elizabeth introduced Millicent to her friend Emily Davis, who you can see here on the left, and she was an English suffragist and educator. And there's this really wonderful, inspiring story that one evening, Davis turned to the two women and declared, "It is quite clear what has to be done. I must devote myself to securing higher education, while you, Elizabeth, open the medical profession to women. After these things are done, we must see about getting the votes." And she turned to Millicent. "You are younger than we are, Millie, so you must attend to that." And all three of them achieved their goals. As mentioned, Garrett Anderson was the first woman to qualify in England as a physician. And Fawcett was a leader in the suffragist movement. So in 2018, you might already know this, but I'm still going to show you a picture of it anyway. Her statue was unveiled in 2018 in Parliament Square. You can see her holding a banner there saying "Courage calls to courage everywhere." And what about Emily Davis? Well, she set up Girton College, which was the first women's college in Britain, and she worked there to train women to degree level, so university degree level, as well as remaining a supporter of the suffragist movement. Now, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson had a daughter, Louisa, who also trained to be a physician, and she set up the Endor Street Military Hospital, which we'll explore next. So during the First World War, Louisa Garrett Anderson and Flora Murray, who you can see here on the right, and other medical women wanted to join in and help the war effort. They saw it as a great chance to show that women doctors were every bit as capable as their male counterparts. They set up a hospital in Hotel Claridge in Paris with the French Red Cross. And after army officials and medical men had gotten over the novelty of female surgeons and seen the women at work, they were impressed and invited the women to set up a second hospital at Wimereux in November 1914. And then in early 1915, they were asked to run a major military hospital in London. So they co-founded the Endor Street Military Hospital in 1915, which became a hospital staffed almost entirely by women involved in the suffrage movement. And you can see a photo of all staff here from 1915. All of the men are on the right-hand side, so 22 male orderlies, which were later reduced to 13. So men were being squeezed out of the staff list. And now the hospital is based at 36 Endell Street, and that's in Covent Garden in London. They faced opposition and hostility throughout the war, but by 1918, the hospital had treated around 26,000 patients and held over 7,000 major operations. You can see a painting here from the Imperial War Museum's collection of an operation at the hospital. Now, they championed the idea that healing was needed in the mind as well as the body. So there was a library at the hospital, a theatre, and there were activities where patients could learn things like embroidery. Now, the RCN Archive Collections holds the papers of one of the nurses who worked here, who was also a suffrage campaigner, and that's Evelyn Maud Clemo. So she trained at Guy's Hospital, qualifying in 1907, and at the beginning of the war, she served in France before being invited by Garrett Anderson to join the Women's Hospital Corps. And you can see her medal here from the Women's Hospital Corps that we have in our archive. So that's the front and the back of it. So she worked at both Paris Wimereux and then at Endell Street Hospital. Now, Anderson and Murray were quite strict with their staff and insisted that all staff not only be equal to men at their jobs, but better. And this indirect activism helped the suffrage movement. And there are many other examples in the war proving to skeptics that when it came to employment and skilled professions, women were just as valuable as men. Now we're going to take a step back a little bit in time so we can explore some history around Marble Arch next. So at this corner of Hyde Park near Marble Arch is Speaker's Corner, where there's a tradition on Sundays for anyone to come and speak on any lawful topic. Politics and religion were and are still frequently discussed, and famous figures who've spoken here in the past include Karl Marx, George Orwell, and Christabel Pankhurst. From 1906 to 1914, supporters of the suffrage movement held meetings in Hyde Park as part of their campaign. And in 1906, they met every single week during the summer. Nurses participated in some of these marches, as shown here in this photograph. And you might recognise the nurse here in the middle, that is Ethel Gordon Fennec, with a group of nurses and midwives at a London suffrage march in 1909. Now, on the 21st of June, 1908, and this is exactly 2 years after the Asquith story that we heard earlier, over 500,000 demonstrators gathered here in Hyde Park, some having marched from 7 different locations across central London, and this came to be known as Women's Sunday, and women who attended were encouraged to wear white dresses for the event. Women's Sunday was the first time that purple, white and green were featured publicly in connection to the WSPU, and the colours were chosen by Evelyn Pankhurst. So purple was for loyalty and dignity, white for purity and green for hope. On meeting at Hyde Park, there were 20 different speaking platforms with 80 different speakers billed. So it was a huge event. And it was actually the largest rally that Britain had ever seen in history at the time. And there were supporters from many different corners of the suffrage movement, including Millicent Fawcett, who you can see speaking passionately here. And I find the banner quite interesting because it's got quite clearly on it, she's a law-abiding suffragist, so she doesn't support the militant tactics that others in the movement were using. Writing in her memoirs about the demonstration, Evelyn Pankhurst wrote, "What a day was this Sunday. It seemed to me that all London had turned out to witness our demonstration. When I mounted my platform in Hyde Park and surveyed the mighty throngs that waited there and the endless crowds that were still pouring into the park from all directions, I was filled with amazement, not unmixed with awe. Never had I imagined that so many people could be gathered together to share in a political demonstration." And I just find that so inspiring. But again, it's like, you know, she maybe didn't see herself as a role model, and it's like suddenly all of these people are there sort of proving the point of, like, yeah, anyway, that's just my thoughts on it. All right, when coming up towards the end of our tour, I'm gonna include this one because I think it is interesting, but I'm gonna go through it quite quickly, and bear with me on this. So just next to Marble Arch is Oxford Street, and it's one of the most famous shopping streets in Europe. And it's here that you'll find Selfridges, which has interesting links to women's history. Bear with me. So it was founded in 1909 by American businessman Harry Gordon Selfridge, and it's got a rich history as being a pioneer for luxury shopping. For example, Selfridges was the first department store to display and sell makeup on top of counters, which was unheard of at the time. And in fact, he had the perfume and makeup sections placed near the entrance of the store, well, to help cover up the smells from the street where there were often horse-drawn carts going past. It might seem quite standard now, but at the time it was almost scandalous to have makeup, you know, out in the open. But it was a huge hit and their sales went through the roof. Selfridges was also the first department store to have toilets for women. I know, right? like recognizing that women were more likely to come and shop. And if you think about it, this was still at a time where women were expected to have chaperones, but the store created a place where women could come independent of an escort, to be free, meet up with friends, and enjoy the elegance that the store offered. And Harry Selfridge, of course, sympathised with the suffrage movement. Again, thinking about the image of the suffrage movement, Christabel Pankhurst said, "Suffragettes must not be dowdy." And you can see an advert here saying, "Fashionable young women are flocking to the department store for dresses, and that most powerful symbol of female emancipation, red lipstick." Selfridges, I know, Selfridges often took out adverts in a few of the suffrage publications. So you can see a notice here in the Suffragette in March 1914 saying they wanted to compliment many of their customers who were suffragettes. And here you can see one of their later adverts in later editions. And in preparation for Women's Sunday in 1908, Selfridges sold white dresses along with accessories in purple and green, which were the colours of the suffrage movement, as we saw earlier. They created window displays and occasionally had the purple, white and green flag flying above the store as well. As a result, they only had their windows smashed once by a suffragette during a more violent demonstration. So, I mean, it's all about knowing who your customers are, and yeah, I mean, it's all marketing, I suppose. Okay, so we're going to be heading to our last stop next, and we're going to be back in Cavendish Square. So as we saw earlier with Colosseum Terrace, nurses use shared social spaces to discuss politics, share best practice with each other, and network. And private clubs formed another location to do this. There were 2 clubs in Cavendish Square. At 28 was the New Cavendish Club. After the First World War, Lady Ampthill, who you can see here on the right, who'd been chairman of the Joint Women's VAD department, felt there should be a first-class ladies' club in London for all VADs past and present. If you're wondering, VAD stands for Voluntary Aid Detachment, and VADs were volunteers who had not previously trained as nurses, but still went to help out in the First World War. Ampthill stated that charges had to be moderate because many potential members were on restricted incomes, and a fundraising appeal was set up to help. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos of this club, but I do have photos of the other club in the square from our archive. So at 20 Cavendish Square was, and this is a mouthful, the Nation's Nurses and Professional Women's Club, which had strong links to the College of Nursing, and it was founded by Lady Cowdray, and they shortened the title to the Cowdray Club, which rolls off the tongue a lot easier. So Cowdray wanted to create a centre for intercourse and recreation, and which should also furnish some of those creature comforts which we associate with the word home. And you can see a photo here of the dining room for the Cowdray Club. When Cowdray gifted the building to the College of Nursing, she wanted to retain some of the opulence of that old Georgian townhouse, you know, to kind of, it was almost like giving a treat to nurses after all the hard work they were doing, to have like such a beautiful building that they could call like a second home. So this room today is where our council room is, and where we still, well, in normal times, hold meetings and events. And you can see a relief bust of Lady Cowdray just here at the top. And you've also got one of Florence Nightingale and Edith Cavell. The club continued after Cowdray died in the 1930s, and some of the members of our History and Nursing Forum can remember when they were students visiting the building in the 70s, seeing meetings of the Cowdray Club, they not being allowed to join just yet as students. It was kind of a little bit like, oh, what's in there? And it's like, oh, it's the Cowdray Club, but you're not allowed to go in there. Yeah, it was quite exclusive. Now, powerful allies such as Lady Cowdray and Lady Ampthill were important for nursing becoming profession, just as high-profile advocates for the suffrage movement helped in securing success for the cause. Now, as we said earlier, a lot of the content for today's talk comes from the tool we wrote for the museum app, which is a self-guided walk through the areas of Harley Street and Marylebone in London. You can, I mean, anyone can access it, and you can still read all the stops even if you're not in London. So just search museum in your app store and you'll be able to find it there, and then just search Royal College of Nursing. So we've reached the end of our little virtual tour now. And if we step back, we can kind of see that bigger picture of this tapestry that we've been inspecting in full. So in 1919, the Nurses Registration Act was passed, setting up a register of trained nurses that remains in place today. And you can find out more about the fight for nursing registration in our online exhibition, Wake Up Slackers. I know, it's great, isn't it? I mean, it's just sums up Sarah Swift perfectly. Just like, wake up, slackers, pay attention. If you're a member of the RCN and you're interested in the history of nursing, then I'd recommend joining the History of Nursing Forum. They've got their own magazine and they help input into our exhibitions and events. Now, we've heard today of nurses who are involved in both the nursing registration movement and the suffrage movement, and nurses continue to campaign and have a political voice today. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act was passed, which meant some women over the age of 30 gained the right to vote, although it wasn't until 1928 that all women and men over the age of 18 could vote. Now, the story didn't end here, and women's movements continue today to try and close the gender gaps in politics, with campaign groups like 50-50 Parliament, which works across different political parties and aims to get more women elected to Parliament. In employment, there are still gaps when it comes to pay. The RCN produced a gender report just last year, which discusses the idea that low-paying nursing could be linked to gender. And women still face discrimination in many areas, so it's vital that campaigns continue, and that's why it's so important that we celebrate International Women's Day, to learn more HERstory and keep our political voice, and we should never forget where we have come from. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about some of the women and nurses who led the campaigns to get us to where we are today. Always remember to stay proud of your history, and thank you for joining us for International Women's Day.